Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world that's technically still within living memory, which makes it somehow even more baffling. We're talking about the 1950s housewife, the woman who was expected to have dinner on the table, lipstick on her face, and absolutely zero opinions about either. Now, before you get comfortable, I want to take a second to genuinely thank the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are. And honestly, the channel wouldn't be what it is without people like you steering us toward the good stuff. Your suggestions shape everything here, and I mean that. So if you're enjoying what I do, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually want to. No pressure, no guilt, no passive-aggressive guilt either. Leave a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, and if you haven't already, the channel's now on Spotify too, links in the description if you'd rather listen while you drift off. Now dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, pull your blanket up, get comfortable, maybe stretch your legs out and feel just how good it is to be a person who is allowed to have a bad hair day. Because tonight, that is a privilege we're going to appreciate deeply. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was actually like to be a woman in the 1950s? Did she secretly want to throw the casserole dish out the window? What happened if she burned dinner? Was there a penalty? Was there a chart? Did she have to smile while doing the ironing, or was a neutral expression acceptable? Could she just sit down at any point for any reason? What did she think about during the 45th consecutive minute of vacuuming? Was ambition allowed, or did it have to be hidden inside a jello mould? And what exactly happened to the women who looked at all of this and thought, no, actually, I'd rather not? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in 1952. You have a husband, a mortgage, a kitchen that is somehow both your kingdom and your prison, and a brand new electric range that everyone expects you to be thrilled about. Your dreams are in a drawer somewhere. Let's go find them. Before the rest of the household stirred, she was already up. Not because she wanted to be, nobody wants to be up at 6 in the morning, but because the domestic standard of the era required that a wife be dressed, composed, and functionally cheerful before her husband opened his eyes. The 1950s housewife didn't stumble to the kitchen in yesterday's clothes with her hair doing something creative. She rose, washed her face, pinned or set her hair, and applied enough makeup to look, in the words of more than one advice column of the era, refreshed and pleasant. The morning wasn't a slow, quiet easing into the day. It was the opening act of a performance that wouldn't end until everyone else was asleep. Think about your own morning for a second. Maybe you hit snooze twice. Maybe you shuffle to the coffee maker in whatever you slept in, squinting at your phone like it personally wronged you. Maybe your hair is doing something architectural, and your first human interaction is with a cat who is also not a morning person. That is a modern luxury so profound it deserves its own national holiday. Because the 1950s housewife did not have a snooze button, not literally and not figuratively. The alarm went off and the performance began. No warm-up, no transition period. The curtain went up immediately. Getting dressed first thing, before coffee, before breakfast, before anyone else had moved, was not just a personal preference. It was a widely circulated directive. Domestic advice columns, women's magazines, and household management guides of the era were unanimous on this point. A wife should never let her husband see her looking unprepared. The logic was breathtaking in its simplicity. He was about to go out into the world to do important things. She should send him off from a household that was already in order, managed by a woman who had clearly been in order for some time. What happened to her between the alarm and his first cup of coffee was her private logistics problem. The hair alone was a project. In an era before the blow-dryer became a household fixture, women maintained their styles with pin curls slept in overnight, or with rollers that had to be removed, brushed out, and set in the morning. The finished result was expected to look effortless, which is the particular cruelty of any beauty standard, but especially impressive when you consider that effortless had actually taken 45 minutes and a great deal of hairspray. Makeup followed, foundation, powder, lipstick at minimum. Not full evening glamour, but enough to look, as the magazines put it, like herself at her best. Which is a sentence that has never not been asking for something unreasonable. And this was all before breakfast existed. While she was becoming presentable, she was also thinking about eggs. The timing of a hot breakfast required its own kind of backward calculation. What needed to go on first, what could wait, how to have everything land on the table simultaneously, while also being available to pour coffee, locate a missing school sock, and greet her husband with an expression that communicated warmth, rather than the specific exhaustion of someone who had been awake for an hour before anyone noticed. The domestic guides of the era described this morning ritual with an almost athletic enthusiasm, as though the ability to be visibly composed at 6:30 in the morning was a skill to be trained and refined. And in a sense, it was. Practiced daily, expected consistently, and completely invisible to everyone it was performed for. Her husband saw a tidy wife and a hot breakfast. Her children saw a mother who had always been there. Nobody saw the hour before any of it, because that hour was hers, and hers alone, which would have been touching if it hadn't been entirely spent preparing to serve everyone else. Breakfast in the 1950s was not a casual affair of cereal poured from a box while standing over the sink. It was a meal, a real one, produced by a woman who'd been awake for an hour already, and was expected to present it with both competence and warmth. Eggs, toast, bacon, juice, coffee, all timed to arrive simultaneously, hot, on a table that was already set. The domestic guides of the era were remarkably specific about this. A husband should never have to ask where his coffee was. He should not arrive at the table to find it lukewarm, delayed, or accompanied by a wife who looked tired. The breakfast was not just food. It was a statement about the kind of household you were running, and by extension the kind of woman you were. Let's be precise about what this meant in practical terms. The coffee had to be made from scratch, percolated or drip, depending on the equipment, but freshly made and ready when he sat down. The eggs had to be cooked to his preference, which she knew because it was her job to know. Toast had to be warm, not the kind that had been sitting in the toaster for 4 minutes while everything else was sorted out. Juice, if it was the frozen concentrate variety that the post-war era had made fashionable, had to be properly reconstituted and stirred, not handed over with visible ice chunks floating in it like a breakfast mocktail nobody ordered. The table itself was part of the presentation. Not formally set necessarily, this was a weekday, not a dinner party, but a clean cloth or placemats, proper utensils in the right place, and nothing on the table that shouldn't be there. Yesterday's newspaper was a variable. Some guides suggested having it folded and ready at his place. Others implied that conversation during breakfast was preferable to newspaper reading, and that a wife might gently encourage this. The idea that she had spent the last hour doing invisible labour and might need a quiet morning herself was not a perspective that appeared in the literature. The food expectations extended to variety. Not the same breakfast every morning that suggested a lack of effort or imagination. Eggs could rotate through their many preparations: scrambled, fried, poached. Pancakes or French toast might appear on a weekend or as a midweek gesture. Oatmeal in winter. Whatever it was supposed to feel considered, like someone had thought about what he might enjoy this morning specifically and produced it accordingly, which is a lovely sentiment for a restaurant and an exhausting permanent condition for a human being who is also the one washing the pan afterward. The coffee was, in many households, the most psychologically loaded element of the entire production. Women's magazines ran articles on the correct way to make coffee, the ratio, the temperature, the freshness of the grounds, and couched the instructions in language that made a mediocre cup of coffee sound like a relationship failure. One infamous advertisement of the era showed a husband looking disappointed at his breakfast table above text that suggested his wife's poor coffee was putting the marriage at risk. The wife in the advertisement looked mortified. The intended reader of the advertisement was supposed to identify with her and immediately reconsider her percolating technique. By the time he pushed back his chair and left for work, breakfast was over in the sense that he was finished with it. For her, breakfast was not over. The table had to be cleared, the dishes washed, the pans scrubbed, the surfaces wiped down, and the kitchen returned to the condition it had been in before any of it happened. The meal that had required an hour of planning, timing, and execution was dismantled in 20 minutes, and the morning, which was already in full swing by 7:30, had barely started. Once the husband had been fed, caffeinated, and dispatched into the world to do important things, the second wave hit. Children needed to be woken, dressed, fed, and pointed toward the front door in a state that reflected well on their mother. Not just clean, presentable. In the 1950s, a child showing up to school with a wrinkled collar or an unwashed face was a comment on the household management of the woman who sent them there. There was no dropping a granola bar into a backpack and wishing them luck. Breakfast had to be eaten at the table, hair had to be combed, and lunch, which she had made herself, had to be packed with something that showed effort. Waking children is, across all eras of human history, an exercise in negotiation with small people who have no interest in your schedule. This was no different in the 1950s, except that the stakes attached to the outcome were higher and entirely the mother's problem. A child who refused to get dressed, threw a tantrum over breakfast, or lost a shoe at the critical moment was not a sympathetic story she could tell at the end of the day. It was evidence of a household she had failed to manage correctly. The chaos of the morning was hers to absorb, resolve, and not visibly survive. The clothing situation deserves particular attention. Children's clothes in this era were not the soft, stretchy, wash-and-wear situation of today. They were structured, pressed, and in many cases required specific undergarments beneath them. Girls wore dresses with sashes that had to be tied. Boys wore trousers with a crease that she had ironed into them the previous afternoon. Everything had buttons. Buttons took time. Time, at 7:45 in the morning with a school bus schedule that did not negotiate, was in very short supply. The child who could not manage their own buttons was working against the whole operation, and the child who could manage their own buttons but preferred not to was working against it with intent. Breakfast for the children was a separate production from the husband's breakfast, managed either simultaneously or sequentially, depending on how the household schedule was arranged, and neither option was simple. Children had opinions about food in the way that adults diplomatically don't admit to, and a child who refused to eat what had been prepared was not just being difficult, she was creating a delay that rippled through the entire morning timeline. The 1950s domestic standard did not have a lot of patience for negotiating with a 6-year-old about oatmeal. You ate what was given to you, and you did it at a reasonable pace because there was a bus. The lunch packing was its own small art form. A sandwich, made that morning, not the night before, because freshness mattered, wrapped in wax paper, accompanied by something sweet, something wholesome, and something that communicated that this child came from a household where lunch was taken seriously. A bruised apple or a carelessly folded sandwich was not the standard. The lunchbox was an extension of the household's reputation, sent out into the world in the hands of a child who would absolutely drop it at some point. And then, finally, the front door. The hats, the coats, the mittens in winter, the reminder about the permission slip for the school trip, the last check of the hair, the adjustment of the collar, the send-off wave from the porch that conveyed warmth and confidence, and nothing of the 45 minutes that had just occurred inside. She watched them go. Then she turned back to the house, which looked like it had hosted a small natural disaster, and she started again. Once everyone had been launched successfully into their respective days, the housewife turned back to the house, which, despite having been lived in by multiple humans since yesterday morning, was expected to look like it had not been. Beds made, dishes washed, surfaces wiped, floors swept. All of this before most modern women have finished their first cup of coffee. The post-war domestic ideal held that a tidy home was a moral achievement, that visible disorder was evidence of personal failure, and that guests might arrive at any moment and would absolutely notice. It was the 1950s equivalent of having your camera on in a Zoom meeting. You had to look like you had it together, always. Making the beds was the opening movement of the morning cleaning sequence, and it was not a casual toss of the duvet in the direction of the pillow. It was a process. Sheets had to be pulled taut, hospital corners folded at the bottom, blankets smoothed without wrinkles across the surface, pillows arranged in a way that communicated intention. A poorly made bed was visible to anyone who walked past the bedroom door, and bedroom doors in the post-war suburb were often open during the day because there was nothing to hide, or rather, nothing was permitted to be visible that might suggest a reason to hide it. The bed was a presentation. The presentation happened every single morning. The kitchen, which had already been used twice for 2 separate meal productions, had to be returned to a state of readiness. Not just washed, reorganized. Surfaces wiped, appliances returned to their correct positions, dish towels refolded and rehung. The floor swept if any toast crumbs had escaped the table, which they always had because children exist. The kitchen was the most visible room in the house, the one visitors always ended up in, the one that said the most about who was running the household. A clean kitchen was the baseline. Anything below baseline was a problem. The living room required its own attention, pillows straightened on the sofa, ashtrays emptied if the household smoked, which many did, magazines fanned on the coffee table at the angle that suggested a relaxed household rather than a chaotic one. The rug might need a quick pass with the carpet sweeper. Dust, in the suburb of the 1950s where windows were open for ventilation, and children tracked in whatever the backyard contained, accumulated faster than anyone wanted to admit. Dusting was not a weekly luxury. It was an ongoing negotiation. The bathroom, the one the whole family had used that morning in rapid succession, needed to be wiped down, the sink rinsed, the towels refolded on the rack, the floor checked for the particular category of debris that a family of 4 generates in a single morning without noticing. There was a children's bathroom if the house had one, which was a separate situation entirely, governed by different and more forgiving laws of disorder, but still required to be presentable before noon. All of this, the entire domestic reset, was supposed to be completed before 10 in the morning. Not because there was somewhere to be, there often wasn't, not immediately, but because a housewife who was still cleaning at 10:30 was a housewife who had not managed her morning efficiently. The domestic guides were specific. A well-run household was one where the daily tidying was completed early, leaving the rest of the day available for more complex tasks. What those more complex tasks were, and whether they were significantly more pleasant than the morning routine, was a question the guides did not entirely answer. Grocery shopping in the 1950s was not a quick errand. It was a logistical exercise that required planning, a list organised by aisle or store layout, a strict budget, and often a toddler in tow. Supermarkets were still a relatively new concept, a genuinely exciting development after wartime rationing, but they were not the streamlined, app-assisted experience of today. You needed to know your prices, stretch your meat budget across multiple dinners, and calculate how far a pound of ground beef could travel across a week's worth of meals. Coupons were clipped. Sales were noted. The housewife who overspent on groceries was not managing her household correctly, and incorrect household management was not a small thing. Getting to the grocery store in the first place was its own variable. In the 1950s suburb, the car often left with the husband in the morning, which meant the housewife either planned her shopping for a day when she had access to the car or she walked, which was possible in denser neighbourhoods and complicated in the sprawling post-war developments that had been built around the assumption that everyone would drive everywhere. A housewife without a car on a grocery day was a housewife doing arithmetic about what she actually needed versus what could wait until Thursday. The shopping list was not casual. It was a planned document, built from the weekly menu she had already determined, because buying groceries without a menu plan was how you overspent, ended up with duplicate cans of things you didn't need, and ran out of something essential on a Wednesday evening when it was too late to go back. The menu plan informed the list. The list was organised by section, produce, meat, dairy, canned goods, so that the trip through the store was efficient and nothing was forgotten that would require a second trip, which was a failure of planning. The meat counter was the centre of the weekly grocery budget negotiation. Meat was the most expensive component of the dinner menu, and the art of the 1950s housewife was making it stretch. A roast on Sunday could become sandwiches on Monday, hash on Tuesday, and soup by Wednesday if managed correctly. Ground beef was versatile and affordable. Chicken, which was more expensive than it is today in real terms, was a special occasion protein in many households. The housewife who could make a week's worth of dinners from a modest meat budget was demonstrating a skill that the domestic culture of the era genuinely admired, not as creativity, but as competence. The children who came along for the shopping were a variable with significant impact on efficiency. A cooperative child made the trip longer but manageable. An uncooperative child turned the cereal aisle into a negotiation, the checkout line into a performance, and the parking lot into something you needed a moment to recover from in the car before you could drive home safely. The grocery trip was not a place where she was permitted to look flustered, because she was out in public, and public was where the performance continued. The unpacking and putting away of the groceries upon return was simply the conclusion of the errand and the beginning of the next task, which was figuring out what to do about lunch, because it was now past noon, and the children, if they were home, needed to eat. And dinner didn't plan itself just because the groceries had been purchased and organised, and the cans had been faced outward in the cupboard like a small supermarket in her own kitchen. The list for next week could wait until tomorrow. She cooked breakfast, she cooked lunch, she cooked dinner, then she cleaned up and did it again tomorrow. The 1950s housewife produced an estimated 1,000 meals per year from a kitchen that was her domain in both the complimentary and the imprisoning sense of the word. Dinner, the main event, had expectations. It was to be hot, balanced, on the table at a consistent time, and composed of enough variety that it did not feel like the household was eating the same 4 meals in permanent rotation, even if it absolutely was. Cooking was not a creative pursuit. It was a daily obligation with aesthetic requirements, and the woman who served it was expected to look like she'd enjoyed making it. Lunch, which sits between breakfast and dinner and is often overlooked in the historical accounting of domestic labour, was not nothing. If children were home during the day, and in the early part of the decade before widespread kindergarten young children often were, lunch was a full meal. Soup from a can was acceptable, but was expected to be accompanied by something. A sandwich, crackers, something that communicated that the meal had been assembled rather than simply heated and poured. If she ate lunch herself, she ate it standing at the counter, usually while doing something else, because sitting down in the middle of the day to eat without a secondary purpose was not the pace the schedule allowed. Dinner planning began well before dinner. The thawing of meat, which could take hours at room temperature in the pre-microwave era, had to be anticipated. Vegetables had to be washed and prepped, If a recipe required something to bake, the oven had to be preheated at the right time, which required knowing what the right time was, which required knowing when dinner was supposed to be served, which was a fixed point around which the entire afternoon organised itself. She was not just cooking. She was project managing a meal in real time with no assistant, no sous chef, and a kitchen that was in use while also being kept clean. The variety requirement was the part that turned a practical skill into an intellectual exercise. A week's worth of dinners had to be different enough from each other that the family did not feel trapped in a repetitive cycle, while also using ingredients that were affordable, available, and within her technical range. Cookbooks helped, and the post-war era produced them prolifically, with cheerful titles and photographs of finished dishes that looked like they'd been styled by professionals, which they had because professional food styling existed, and her kitchen did not. She followed the recipes as closely as possible, and considered it a reasonable evening if the finished result resembled the photograph in the general colour palette. The casserole was the working architecture of the 1950s dinner table. It was economical, scalable, and could be assembled ahead of time if the afternoon had been particularly demanding. It combined a protein, a starch, a vegetable, and usually a can of condensed soup that served as both sauce and structural element, all baked together into something that was technically a complete meal in a single dish. This was efficient in practice and modest in ambition, but the era's food culture wanted more than efficiency. It wanted impressiveness, which is how you get a casserole with crushed potato chips on top, presented as a finishing touch, which it absolutely was not. Cleaning up after dinner was the final chapter of a production that had begun at 6 a.m. and had never fully stopped. The dishes, the pots, the pans, all washed by hand, dried, and put away. The table wiped, the leftovers stored, the kitchen returned to the version of itself that was ready to be used again in 9 hours. She finished the dishes, and the day was technically over, in the sense that the kitchen was clean, and the scheduled obligations had been met. Whether she was finished was a different question, and one that the domestic literature of the era did not particularly concern itself with. If there is one culinary artifact that perfectly captures the spirit of 1950s domestic life, it is the jello mould. Not jello as dessert, which is strange enough, but jello as architecture, savoury, suspended, and served at dinner parties with the confidence of someone who had done something impressive. Vegetables encased in lime gelatin, shrimp floating in tomato aspic, cream cheese suspended in lemon jello alongside pineapple chunks, presented on a lettuce leaf as though it were a normal thing that normal people wanted to eat. The 1950s housewife didn't invent this trend, but she was expected to master it, because the ability to produce a structurally sound moulded salad was apparently a measure of domestic competence. The gelatin trend had roots in the pre-war era, when aspic, savoury items suspended in clarified meat stock was considered elegant and technically demanding, the kind of dish that demonstrated real kitchen skill. After the war, processed gelatin became cheap, widely available, and aggressively marketed. The Jello company, understanding that savoury gelatin dishes had cachet in domestic circles, published recipe books specifically designed for the housewife who wanted to produce something that looked architectural and impressive without requiring professional training. What they produced was a category of food that looked impressive in the photograph and arrived at the table in a state of wobbly, semi-translucent ambiguity that guests were expected to receive enthusiastically. The mechanics of the mould were the first challenge. Gelatin had to be dissolved in hot water, combined with additional cold water or other liquid, mixed with whatever was going inside it, which could be almost anything, and in the 1950s often was, and then poured into a mould that had been rinsed with cold water so that the finished product could be released cleanly. The mould then went into the refrigerator for several hours, This meant that a gelatin dish had to be started well in advance, which required planning, and that the refrigerator space it occupied while setting was not available for other things, which required additional logistics and kitchens that were not large. The unmoulding was where things frequently went wrong. A jello mould released correctly from its container arrived on the serving plate in a clean, defined shape. A ring, a dome, an elaborate fluted form with its contents suspended within it, in a pattern that looked intentional. A jello mould that did not release correctly arrived on the serving plate in a way that required immediate narrative reframing by the hostess, who had to present a partially collapsed shrimp aspic, as though this was also a valid outcome. The domestic guide suggested running a thin knife around the edge, dipping the outside briefly in warm water, and inverting with confidence. Confidence, in the context of a wobbly gelatin structure, was doing significant structural work. The flavour logic of the savoury mould was genuinely difficult to reconstruct from this distance. Lime gelatin with cream cheese and pineapple might have been served as a salad, positioned before the main course, presented on a lettuce leaf, treated as a cool and refreshing first course on a warm evening, which is the most charitable interpretation available. Tomato aspic with celery and olives was similarly classified as a salad, served in individual portions and consumed by guests who'd agreed to this situation by accepting the dinner party invitation. Nobody complained because complaining about the food at a dinner party was socially impermissible, and also because this was simply what food was in 1957. The jello mould represented something beyond its ingredients. It was the era's appetite for novelty applied to the dinner table, the belief that modern food science, like modern appliances and modern suburbs, was an improvement on what came before. The can of condensed soup, the instant gelatin, the frozen vegetable. These were symbols of progress. The woman who used them skillfully was a modern housewife, living in a modern household, making the most of what the post-war economy had delivered to her. That what it delivered occasionally included shrimp in lime gelatin was a price the era was fully prepared to pay. The post-war era arrived with an avalanche of new kitchen appliances, each one marketed as a revolution in convenience, each one adding a new category of expectation to the housewife's day. The electric range replaced the old gas stove and required learning from scratch. The pressure cooker promised faster dinners, but had a reputation for exploding if you looked at it wrong. The stand mixer, the electric can opener, the automatic percolator, all cheerfully advertised in magazines as time-saving miracles that would free the modern woman from drudgery. What they actually did was raise the standard of what a home-cooked meal was supposed to look like, because now you had the equipment to do it properly, and there was no excuse for doing it any other way. The electric range was the centerpiece of the modern post-war kitchen, and it arrived in American homes with an advertising campaign that treated it as a genuine domestic luxury. It was cleaner than gas, more precise in theory, and fitted with multiple burners and an oven that could be set to a specific temperature, an improvement over the older ranges where oven temperature was assessed by intuition, experience, and the occasional burned hand. Learning to cook on an electric range after years of gas was a real adjustment, because the burners retained heat differently. The response time was slower, and the visual cues she had learned to read, the height and colour of a gas flame, were gone, replaced by a flat coil that glowed dully and gave away nothing. The pressure cooker occupied a particular position in the 1950s kitchen, theoretically invaluable, practically terrifying. It reduced cooking time for tough cuts of meat and dried beans dramatically, which was a genuine advantage in households where dinner had to be on the table by 6 and the meat had come out of the freezer that morning. But the pressure cooker required careful management. The valve had to be monitored. The pressure had to be released correctly. There were stories, circulated with the speed and enthusiasm of all domestic horror stories, of pressure cookers that had failed spectacularly, lids propelled towards ceilings, contents distributed across kitchen walls, the resulting cleanup making the original time-saving entirely theoretical. She used it anyway because the cookbook said to. The stand mixer, which had been available since the 1930s but became widely affordable in the post-war period, was genuinely useful and represented one of the few appliances that delivered on its promise. If you baked, and the 1950s housewife baked regularly, because baked goods were expected at coffee mornings, at school events, at the dinner party as dessert, and simply because the family expected something sweet in the afternoon, the stand mixer made the work significantly less physically demanding. It was also loud and took up considerable counter space, but counter space was a sacrifice the era was willing to make for the ability to cream butter and sugar without a wooden spoon and 20 minutes of effort. The refrigerator was not new in the 1950s, but it was becoming larger, more reliable, and more centrally featured in the kitchen layout, and with it came a new set of organisational expectations. The refrigerator that was always stocked, well organised, and free of spoiled items was a refrigerator managed by a competent housewife. The refrigerator with items pushed to the back past their useful date, half-open cans sealed with foil in optimistic defiance of food safety, and a vegetable drawer containing something that had ceased to be identifiable. That was a different story, and not a flattering one. What the appliance revolution of the 1950s actually produced was not freedom from domestic labour, but an elevation of domestic standards that required more labour to meet. The woman with a stand mixer was expected to produce more elaborate baked goods than the woman without one. The woman with a modern range was expected to cook with more variety and precision. The woman with a refrigerator large enough to store a week's worth of groceries was expected to plan further ahead. Every tool that was supposed to save time simultaneously raised the floor of what was acceptable. The machinery of modern domesticity was extraordinary, and it belonged entirely to her, and it never, not once, stopped running. There is a particular psychological cruelty to cleaning a house that is actively being lived in. You clean the kitchen, and someone makes a sandwich. You vacuum the living room, and someone walks through it. The 1950s housewife understood this paradox intimately, because her entire afternoon was structured around it. Laundry had to be washed, wrung, hung, and in many households still ironed before being folded and put away in drawers that no one would appreciate. Bathrooms had to be scrubbed. Windows in a more thorough week had to be washed. The floors, depending on the surface, required sweeping or mopping or waxing. The domestic manuals of the era recommended a weekly schedule broken into daily tasks so that the home could be maintained at a consistent standard without becoming overwhelming. The word overwhelming was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Laundry in the early 1950s was a significant physical undertaking, even with a washing machine, which not every household had at the beginning of the decade, though ownership expanded rapidly as the economy grew and appliance prices dropped. The automatic washing machine was a genuine improvement over the wringer washer that preceded it, but it still required loading, monitoring through its cycles, and unloading before the clothes sat too long and developed the particular grievance of fabric left damp in a drum. Clothes then went to the line. There were no household dryers in most homes until the mid-decade at the earliest, where they were hung in an order that was not random, because a laundry line visible from the street was, like most things visible from the street, a small performance. The ironing that followed the laundry was a separate afternoon project, ideally positioned for a day when the children were at school and the radio was on, which was the closest the era offered to background entertainment during domestic tasks. Cotton, which was the dominant fabric of the era for both clothing and household linens, required ironing to look presentable. Polyester blends that held their shape were emerging but not yet everywhere. This meant that nearly everything that came off the line needed to pass under the iron before it went back into a drawer or a closet. Shirts, trousers, dresses, children's clothing, table linens if a dinner was coming, handkerchiefs, which the era still used, and pillowcases because wrinkle pillowcases were visible to anyone who walked past the bedroom. Floor care was its own weekly category. Hardwood floors required sweeping and periodic waxing with paste wax applied by hand and buffed to a shine, which was as physically demanding as it sounds. Linoleum, which covered many post-war kitchen floors, required mopping, and if the household was following the recommendations of the floor wax advertisements, which were specific, enthusiastic, and produced by companies that sold floor wax, it also required periodic application of liquid wax to maintain the shine that was apparently essential to a well-managed kitchen floor. The carpet in the living room required vacuuming, and the corners of the carpet where the vacuum couldn't reach required the attachment that nobody liked using. The bathroom cleaning that the morning had already handled at a maintenance level required a deeper clean on a weekly basis, the toilet scrubbed properly, the tub cleaned with a product that the era's cleaning supply manufacturers were happy to specify, the tile wiped, the grout attended to. The cleaning products of the 1950s were not gentle. They were effective and pungent, applied by hand in most cases, because the rubber gloves that might have protected the skin were not always used and were not specifically recommended by the domestic culture, which did not spend a great deal of time worrying about the housewife's hands. By the time the afternoon cleaning cycle had been completed, it was nearly time to begin dinner, which meant the afternoon, which had been entirely consumed by cleaning, was over. The kitchen that had just been cleaned would be used for the next 3 hours to produce a meal, and then cleaned again. The floors that had been swept would be walked on by the returning family. The surfaces that had been wiped would be touched. And tomorrow the whole thing would begin again from the top, with the same patience and the same invisible effort, and nobody would remark on any of it because the whole point was that it looked effortless. Ironing deserves its own segment because it occupied more hours of the 1950s housewife's life than almost any single other task, and it is exactly as tedious as it sounds multiplied by the volume of clothing involved. Not just shirts, everything. Sheets, pillowcases, the children's school clothes, her husband's work trousers, which required a careful crease in precisely the right place, her own house dress, because even what you wore to clean the house was expected to be pressed. The iron itself was hot, the board was uncomfortable to stand at for extended periods, and the window for burning something was constant and real. There were no wrinkle-resistant fabrics. There was no throwing things in the dryer for 10 minutes to smooth them out. There was just the iron, the board, and an afternoon. The ironing board was a permanent fixture in most households, rather than something stored and retrieved as needed, because storing and retrieving it was an additional task, and it was going to be needed again tomorrow anyway. It was set up in a room with adequate light, often the kitchen, often near the radio, at a height that required the person standing at it to slightly lean forward, which after 40 minutes produced the specific backache of ironing and no other activity. The iron itself was heavy, because it needed thermal mass to maintain its temperature consistently as it moved across fabric, and the weight that made it effective was the same weight that made it tiring to use for the length of a Tuesday afternoon. The sequence in which items were ironed was not arbitrary. It was a learned hierarchy, passed down through domestic tradition, or acquired from household management guides, organised around the logic of keeping the iron at the right temperature for the right fabric. Delicate items, handkerchiefs, fine blouses, went first when the iron was cooler. Sturdier cotton items came after the temperature had been raised. Linen, which required significant heat and a slightly damp cloth to release its creases fully, came later still. Moving through this sequence without scorching anything required continuous attention to the iron's temperature setting, the dampness of the fabric and the direction of the stroke, always with the grain of the fabric, never against it, never leaving the iron stationary on the cloth for longer than the moment required, shirts were the most technically demanding garment in the rotation. A man's dress shirt worn to an office job in the 1950s was expected to be crisply ironed from collar to cuffs, and the order of operations was specific: collar first, then cuffs, then sleeves, then the body, always with the iron moving in a direction that smoothed without introducing new creases at the wrong angles. The collar required particular attention because it was the most visible part of the finished garment, the part that showed above the jacket, the part that announced whether or not the shirt had been ironed by someone who knew what they were doing. A badly ironed collar on a husband's shirt was the kind of detail a perceptive person might notice, and the 1950s suburb ran on perceptive people. The children's school clothes occupied a volume of ironing that their small size made deceptively manageable looking. A small shirt is still a shirt. Small trousers still have a leg and a crease. A girl's school dress still had a skirt that needed to lay flat, a bodice that had to be smooth, and a collar that answered to the same standards as everyone else's. There were multiple children in most households of the era, which meant multiple wardrobes moving through the ironing pile on a weekly schedule that didn't pause for illness, bad weather, or the particular exhaustion of a Thursday afternoon when the pile was still significant and dinner was in 3 hours. What the ironing looked like from the inside, the internal experience of standing at a board for 90 minutes moving a hot implement across fabric, while the radio played and the house was quiet, has been described in retrospective accounts by women of the era with a remarkably consistent vocabulary. Monotonous, meditative, lonely, occasionally peaceful, in the way that a task requiring continuous low-level attention can silence the louder parts of a busy mind, and sometimes simply, plainly, relentlessly boring, in the specific way that a task you will do again next week and every week after that generates a particular emotional texture. Not quite despair, not quite contentment, just ironing for the foreseeable future on a board in a quiet house. The 1950s housewife is frequently depicted in vintage advertisements wearing a full dress, a pearl necklace, low heels, and an expression of serene satisfaction while scrubbing a toilet, and the remarkable thing is that this was not entirely satirical. The domestic ideal of the era held that a woman's appearance was a reflection of her character, and that character did not take the afternoon off because you were elbow deep in housework. House dresses were a practical concession, a specific category of garment designed to be worn during domestic labour, but they were still expected to be clean, pressed, and worn with an apron to protect them. Lipstick, in many households, was non-negotiable. You might be mopping the floor, but you were doing it as a put-together woman. The house dress itself is worth a moment of examination because it was a garment category that existed specifically because the era needed one. It was not a casual garment in the modern sense, not a sweatshirt, not leggings, not the softly forgiving category of clothing that contemporary women reach for on days when they are not going anywhere and do not intend to. The house dress was structured. It had buttons or a zip or a wrap closure. It had a defined waist. It came in cheerful prints, florals, small geometrics, the occasional abstract pattern that the post-war design sensibility found modern, and it was made of cotton that needed to be laundered and ironed regularly, because a wrinkled house dress was still a wrinkled garment and still said something about the woman wearing it. The house dress was the uniform of domestic labour, and like all uniforms it had standards. The apron went over the house dress to protect it, which raises the immediate question of what she wore to protect the apron. But this is a philosophical inquiry the era did not entertain. Aprons in the 1950s came in two categories. The practical full apron that covered the front of the body from chest to below the knee, designed for serious cooking and cleaning tasks, and the half apron that tied at the waist and was primarily decorative, worn when guests were present or when dinner was about to be served and the heavy work was already done. The half-apron communicated that the hostess was still technically in kitchen mode while also being entirely presentable, which was the sartorial tightrope the era required women to walk constantly. The lipstick question was real and debated even at the time. The domestic guides that recommended it framed it as a matter of self-respect. A woman who maintained her appearance did so for herself as much as for anyone else, and the small act of applying lipstick before beginning the day's work was a gesture of personal dignity rather than performance for an audience. This is a charitable reading. The less charitable but equally accurate reading is that a woman whose appearance visibly declined during the day, whose hair escaped its pins, whose face went bare, who looked by 2 in the afternoon like someone who had been working since 6 in the morning, was not meeting the aesthetic standard the era placed on women in their domestic role. Looking tired was a kind of failure. Looking like you'd been trying not to look tired was the acceptable alternative. The gap between the advertisement and the reality was, of course, enormous. Real women cleaning real bathrooms in the middle of real Tuesday afternoons were not wearing pearl necklaces. They were wearing whatever was comfortable and practical and would survive contact with cleaning products, and they were doing it without an audience and without a photographer. But the advertisement existed because the ideal existed, and the ideal was specific. A woman could be performing the least glamorous labour imaginable, and the presentation of that labour still mattered. Not because anyone was watching, because the standard was the standard regardless. What the appearance requirement actually produced beneath the practical surface of house dresses and aprons was a permanent low-level performance tax, an additional layer of effort applied to every task. Not the task itself, but the management of how the task looked from the outside. She was not just cleaning. She was cleaning in a way that could be interrupted at any moment by a neighbour at the door or a husband home early, and when that interruption came, she should look like the kind of woman for whom interruption was not an inconvenience. That this required continuous background effort that men doing equivalent physical labour were not asked to contribute was an observation the era preferred not to make directly. One of the most specific and well-documented expectations of the era was the transformation that was supposed to occur in the hour before the husband came home. The housewife, who had been cleaning, cooking and managing children since before breakfast, was expected to, as one widely circulated domestic guide put it, freshen up and look attractive before he walked through the door. This meant changing out of the house dress, touching up makeup, doing something about the hair, and ideally having the children clean, quiet, and not mid-tantrum. Dinner was supposed to be nearly ready, but not yet on the table. The atmosphere of the home should communicate that the household had been running smoothly in his absence, and that his return was the event the whole day had been building toward. The timing of the transformation was its own logistical puzzle. Dinner had to be in a state that allowed for a 20-minute pause, something in the oven that would hold, a pot that could simmer unattended, nothing that required her to be actively at the stove when he arrived. This meant planning the dinner around the transformation rather than simply cooking it, which added an invisible layer to the already complex dinner planning project. A roast was good for this purpose. Something requiring active finishing at the stove was less good, because a woman who greeted her husband from behind a pan of bacon was a woman whose transformation had been deferred, and the guides were clear that the transformation should not be deferred. Changing clothes at 5:30 was a ritual that had its own logic. The house dress and apron, which had absorbed the day's work in both the literal and metaphorical sense, were replaced with something that communicated the transition from the domestic working hours to the domestic social hours, the portion of the day when the husband was present and the household was performing its evening function. She did not change into formal clothing. She changed into something that looked like she had not been cleaning since 7 in the morning, which was, in its own way, a more demanding costume requirement than formal clothing because it had to look effortless, while communicating the specific distance from effort. The children had to be managed in the same window. Children who had been home all afternoon, or who had returned from school in the mid-afternoon carrying the accumulated energy of a day spent sitting still, were not naturally inclined toward the quiet, tidy presentation the guides recommended. They needed to be redirected, snacks given, arguments resolved, homework started or at least gestured toward in the 40 minutes before arrival, so that what he encountered at the door was a household in a pleasant equilibrium, rather than the actual condition of a household containing children in the late afternoon. The specific domestic guide most often cited in retrospective discussions of this ritual is a 1950s pamphlet that circulated widely enough to become cultural shorthand for the era's domestic expectations. It advised the housewife to have a cool drink ready for her husband, to listen to him without immediately introducing the day's problems, to speak in a low, soft voice, and to make the home a place of peace and order after his day in the demanding world. What was the corollary advice for the woman who had also had a demanding day? There was not one, because the assumption was that her day, however full, had been conducted inside the home and therefore did not qualify for the same consideration. The world outside was hard. The home was where that hardness was supposed to dissolve. She was the mechanism of that dissolution, available at 6 o'clock, freshly changed, calm and ready. The cruelty of this particular expectation was not in any individual element but in the accumulation. She had been working since before breakfast. She'd managed the house, the children, the meals, the shopping, the cleaning, and now, in the final hour of the day, she was asked to erase the evidence of all of it and appear as though the day had not touched her. To look rested when she was tired, to look calm when she was depleted, to make her effort invisible so completely that his arrival felt like the beginning of something rather than the end of everything she had already done. The 1950s domestic manual, and there were many, was consistent on one point. The husband came home from work tired, and the home should be a refuge from that tiredness. His day had been hard. His work had been stressful. He had carried the financial weight of the household on his shoulders, and when he crossed the threshold, the last thing he needed was a list of problems. The children's misbehaviour, the plumber who hadn't shown up, the neighbour dispute, the mounting household tension, the existential weight of spending every day performing the same tasks with no credit and no end in sight. These were not appropriate dinner conversation topics. The housewife was expected to absorb the friction of domestic life so that it never reached him, to filter out the difficulty and present only the smoothed, competent surface. This filtering function was not acknowledged as emotional labour because emotional labour was not a concept the era had named. It was simply expected as part of the role, a natural extension of the housewife's responsibility to manage the atmosphere of the home, which included managing the information that travelled through it. Problems that could be solved without his involvement were to be solved without his involvement. Problems that required his awareness were to be introduced carefully, at the right moment, in the right tone, framed in a way that did not constitute complaint and did not suggest that the household was anything less than adequately managed. The right moment was not immediately upon arrival. The guides were specific. Let him settle. Let him change clothes if that was his habit. Let him have the drink she'd prepared, sit in his chair, and decompress from the transition between the world outside and the home. The first 15 minutes of his return were not for logistics. They were for the gradual re-entry of a man who'd been in the demanding world all day and needed a buffer before he could receive domestic information. She'd been receiving domestic information all day without a buffer, but this was not a parallel the era drew. The dinner table was the primary social space of the household, and the conversation that happened there was expected to be pleasant. He might talk about his work in general terms. She might share something about the children, framed positively. The children might contribute something about their day that reflected well on the family's general functioning. What dinner was not for? the specific frustrations of her day, financial anxieties beyond the abstract, marital dissatisfaction, the gradual accumulating weight of a life structured around everyone's needs except her own. These were not dinner conversation. These were, in the vocabulary of the era, complaints, and complaints from a housewife were not just socially impermissible, they were evidence of a character deficiency, an ingratitude for the material comfort of a home and a provider. The emotional consequence of this arrangement was a particular kind of isolation that did not look like isolation from the outside. She was surrounded by people. She was embedded in a household, a neighbourhood, a social calendar. She was never alone in the logistical sense. But the filtering function, the continuous work of processing difficulty privately, resolving it internally, and presenting only the acceptable surface, meant that she was emotionally alone in almost every significant sense. The problems she managed were invisible. The effort she expended was unacknowledged. The feelings that accumulated had no sanctioned outlet and no recognized legitimacy. What this produced, over years and decades in millions of households across the country, was a kind of chronic suppression so normalized that the women experiencing it often couldn't identify it as a problem. It was simply how things were. He was tired from work. She managed the house. These were the terms of the arrangement, agreed upon implicitly at the altar and confirmed daily by every magazine, advertisement, television program and neighbour's kitchen she had ever been inside. That the arrangement might be worth examining was an idea that was coming, slowly from the outside, in books being written and read in quiet houses during the hours when everyone else was elsewhere, and she finally had a moment to herself. Hosting in the 1950s was not a casual experience. It was a demonstration of cooking ability, of household management, of taste, of the kind of woman you were and therefore the kind of man your husband had married. A dinner party required weeks of planning. The menu had to be ambitious but not showy. The table had to be set correctly down to the placement of every fork. The house had to be cleaner than it normally was, which was already very clean, and the hostess herself had to appear effortlessly in command of all of it, while also being warm, charming, and present in conversation. The meal could not be late. The courses had to land in sequence. Nothing could visibly go wrong, and if it did, the hostess was expected to absorb it without letting the disruption surface on her face. The planning began with the guest list, which was itself a minor social calculation. Who got along with whom, who was in what standing with which other couple, whether the mix of people would produce pleasant conversation, or the particular social friction of two men who disagreed about something important, seated directly across from each other. The hostess was responsible for the composition of the evening, as well as its execution, which meant that the social intelligence required to assemble a compatible group of people was a prerequisite to all the cooking and cleaning that followed. The menu planning was a serious undertaking. A dinner party menu in this era followed a structure: an appetizer or starter, a main course with accompanying dishes, a dessert, coffee. Each course had its own preparation requirements, its own timing, its own possibility of failure. The main course was typically the most elaborate: a roast, a stuffed bird, something that had been in the oven for hours and needed to come out at the exact right moment, rested for exactly the right amount of time, and carved or served in a way that looked controlled and intentional, rather than like someone had been monitoring it anxiously for the past 45 minutes. She had been monitoring it anxiously for the past 45 minutes. The table setting was a specific domestic skill taught in the household management literature with diagrams. Fork placement, knife placement, the position of the water glass relative to the wine glass, the folding of the napkin, all of these had correct answers, and an incorrectly set table was something a knowledgeable guest would notice, and a knowledgeable hostess would not permit. The china came out for a dinner party. The silver, if there was silver, came out and had to be polished beforehand, a separate task that lived in the hours before the event, because tarnished silver at a dinner table was a detail that said something the hostess didn't want said. The hostess's appearance was the final element of the production, prepared after the house was ready and the food was in its pre-service state. She dressed for her own dinner party as she would dress to attend someone else's, carefully, appropriately, with hair and makeup that communicated she had not spent the entire day cooking and cleaning, despite having spent the entire day cooking and cleaning. The transformation from domestic worker to gracious hostess happened in the bedroom in the 30 minutes before the guests arrived, and when the doorbell rang, she answered it with the specific warmth of a woman for whom this evening was a pleasure, rather than the conclusion of a 2-week project involving multiple shopping trips, significant physical labour, and at least one moment of genuine panic about the aspic. What the guests experienced and what the hostess experienced were 2 almost entirely different evenings. They experienced a pleasant social occasion in a well-run home, served a good meal by a charming woman who seemed to enjoy having them. She experienced the continuous management of a live production, monitoring the timing of each course from the table, excusing herself at the correct moments to attend to the kitchen, managing any deviations from the plan invisibly, and keeping the conversation going as a secondary function of a brain that was primarily occupied with service logistics. By the end of the evening, when the guests had gone and the dishes were stacked and the table needed clearing, she was the last one standing. And the morning after a dinner party, the clean-up was hers too. The 1950s suburb was a masterpiece of proximity and judgment. Houses were close together, windows faced the street, and daily life was visible in ways that made it essentially communal, whether you wanted it to be or not. The lawn had to be mowed, the front step had to be swept, the children had to be dressed before they went outside. The car in the driveway could not sit unwashed for too long without comment. What your neighbours thought of your household was not separate from your social standing. It was your social standing. The housewife who let the curtains go unwashed or whose children were too loud in the yard was not just failing at housekeeping, she was failing at being a neighbour, a wife, a woman, and a citizen of the subdivision. The suburb of the 1950s was designed with a particular visibility built in. The houses faced the street. The front yards were open, no fences between properties, a design principle borrowed from the landscape architecture of the era that was meant to communicate openness and community, but functioned equally well as a mutual surveillance system. Everyone could see everyone's front yard. Everyone could see who was coming and going and when. Everyone could see whether your lawn had been mowed this week and whether the children playing in it were dressed appropriately for the weather and the neighbourhood standards. The windows were particularly active. Curtains in the 1950s suburb were both a decorative element and an information management tool. Clean, properly hung curtains communicated a household in good order. Dirty or sagging curtains communicated something else. The curtains themselves had to be washed periodically, taken down, laundered, rehung, and if they were the net variety that was fashionable in the era, stretched while still damp on curtain stretchers to maintain their shape. This was a half-day task for windows that nobody except the neighbours was monitoring, but the neighbours' monitoring was sufficient justification for the entire project. The front step was a small theatre. She swept it because the condition of the front step was one of the first things a visitor or a neighbour passing on the street would register about the household. A swept step communicated that someone was paying attention. Leaves allowed to accumulate communicated the opposite. During the seasons when the trees were dropping things, sweeping the front step was a task that had to be repeated frequently enough to maintain the impression of continuous attention, which was the impression the era required. Not that she had swept it this morning, that she was the kind of woman who swept it this morning. The children, when they went outside, were extensions of the household's reputation. A child playing in the yard in clean, appropriate clothing was a child whose mother had the household in order. A child in dirty clothes, or without a coat in cold weather, or behaving in a way that suggested insufficient supervision, that child was a comment on the woman inside the house who had sent them out. This placed the housewife in the position of monitoring her children's outdoor presentation, not just for their comfort and safety, but for what it communicated to every neighbour with a window facing the yard, which was all of them. What made the suburban visibility particularly interesting as a social mechanism was that it operated without anyone having to say anything directly. Nobody knocked on the door to note that the curtains looked dusty. Nobody formally complained about the lawn. The enforcement happened through a more diffuse social pressure, the sense, accurate and pervasive, that everything was observed, that nothing was invisible, and that the standards of the neighbourhood were maintained collectively by the simultaneous awareness of everyone in it. She cleaned the front step because someone might notice if she didn't. That someone might notice was enough. Childcare in the 1950s was the near-exclusive domain of the mother, and it was not framed as a burden so much as a biological calling that she was lucky to have. She got up with the babies at night. She managed the illnesses, the school runs, the scraped knees, the birthday parties, the homework, the fighting, and the day-to-day chaos of keeping small humans alive and reasonably civilized. Father was present in the evenings and on weekends in a vague, newspaper-adjacent way, available for the occasional stern word or special outing, but not expected to participate in the continuous, exhausting management of daily childcare. The emotional and logistical labour was hers, invisibly and completely. The nighttime portion of childcare is where the invisible labour becomes most starkly visible. A baby who woke at 2 a.m. woke the mother. Not because the father could not hear it. He could. But because the established division of household responsibility meant that nighttime infant care fell within her domain, and waking him was an imposition on the sleep of someone who had a job to get to in the morning. She also had a job to get to in the morning, in the sense that the household would require her full functioning regardless of how many times the baby had woken up, but this parallel was not acknowledged by the architecture of the arrangement. She got up, she handled it, she went back to sleep if she could, and started the day at 6 regardless. Illness was one of the more relentless components of raising children, and in an era before widespread vaccination had eliminated many of the serious childhood diseases, illness arrived with significant frequency, and occasionally with serious weight. Measles, mumps, chicken pox, whooping cough. These were not uncommon childhood experiences in the early part of the decade, and each one meant days or weeks of a sick child requiring management while the rest of the household continued to need feeding and cleaning. A sick child was confined to bed. His temperature was monitored, his meals were adjusted, his boredom was managed. His symptoms were assessed against the threshold that would require a doctor's visit, and the doctor, when called, was deferred to without question on all matters of treatment, because the 1950s mother's medical authority ended at the production of symptoms for the professional to evaluate. The birthday party deserves specific attention as a domestic event because it combined several categories of expectation simultaneously. It required food, a cake, baked and frosted at home because the era had not yet normalized the purchased bakery cake as an acceptable option for a child's birthday, plus sandwiches or other foods appropriate for a table of 7-year-olds. It required games, organized and supervised. It required the management of multiple children in a domestic space, which is a logistical challenge that scales non-linearly with the number of children involved. It required the subsequent clean-up of that space, and it was expected to look, from the outside, like something she had assembled with pleasure and ease, because a child's birthday party was one of the visible performances of the household, and the mother's role in it was to make it happen seamlessly. The homework management that occupied the after-school hours was a daily negotiation between what the child needed to do and the child's comprehensive lack of interest in doing it. She was expected to ensure the homework was completed, to assist when the child encountered difficulty, and to do this while simultaneously preparing dinner and managing whatever else the household required in the late afternoon. This was the specific geometry of the 1950s motherhood. Multiple simultaneous demands, each one requiring real attention, none of them deferrable, all of them invisible to the people who went to bed in the clean house having eaten a hot meal and having been helped with their long division. The post-war birth rate in America surged with a particular enthusiasm that the era's domestic propaganda was more than happy to celebrate. Babies were good, more babies were better. A house full of children was proof of a successful marriage, a healthy nation, and a woman who was fulfilling her purpose. What was less discussed in the cheery magazine spreads and the appliance advertisements was the physical and psychological reality of bearing and raising multiple children in close succession with minimal help, minimal medical support by modern standards, and no cultural permission to admit that you were anything other than grateful. The post-war housewife was expected to want this life. The women who didn't were a problem that had not yet been named. The numbers are worth sitting with for a moment. The total fertility rate in the United States peaked in 1957 at just over 3.5 children per woman. In the context of post-war suburban America, a household with 3 or 4 children was not unusual. It was the norm toward which cultural expectations pointed, and advertising was designed. The houses of the Levittown model were built with multiple bedrooms because multiple children were the anticipated outcome. The station wagon was marketed as the family vehicle because families of this size required one. The demographic reality of the baby boom was a cultural mandate as much as a biological event, shaped by social pressure, limited options, and the specific economic and psychological circumstances of a generation that had survived depression and war and arrived at prosperity wanting stability and the symbols of it. The physical reality of multiple pregnancies in close succession was something the era's domestic cheerfulness consistently underplayed. Pregnancy in the 1950s was managed according to medical protocols that bear almost no resemblance to contemporary prenatal care. Women were advised to gain minimal weight, far less than is now recommended. Activity was restricted. The hospital birth, which had become the standard by mid-century, was managed primarily by male obstetricians who made decisions about labour and delivery that the labouring woman was not expected to participate in meaningfully. Anaesthesia was used routinely, which meant many women experienced the births of their children in states of partial consciousness or not at all, receiving the baby afterward as an accomplished fact. The postpartum period, which contemporary medicine now understands to carry significant risk for mood disorders and requires careful monitoring, was in the 1950s a period of expected rapid return to domestic function. The baby was home within days, the household needed managing, and the social expectation was gratitude and adjustment rather than recovery and support. Postpartum depression existed, obviously. The neurological and hormonal realities of childbirth were not altered by the era's cultural preferences, but it was not named as such, was not routinely screened for, and was most commonly addressed either by the prescription of tranquilizers or by the gentle suggestion that the mother was adjusting to a beautiful new phase of life and would settle into it shortly. What nobody said directly, in the magazines or the advice columns or the conversations across the neighbourhood's back fences, was that the accumulation of children and the domestic demands they generated, absorbed entirely by one person, without acknowledged difficulty, without legitimate complaint, and without any structure for genuine relief or support, was genuinely hard in a way that the cultural vocabulary of the era could not accommodate. There was no word for it. There was just another load of laundry, another night feeding, another afternoon managing the noise and need of small people who were loved deeply and exhausting continuously, in a house where the standard was that none of this should show. Medical authority in the 1950s carried a particular weight, and it was deployed against women with remarkable regularity. Doctors told new mothers how to feed their babies, how to manage their households, how to keep their husbands happy, and on frequent occasion, how to adjust their attitudes when those attitudes veered toward dissatisfaction. Tranquilizers, sold with names like Milltown and widely nicknamed Mother's Little Helper, were prescribed to housewives experiencing anxiety, restlessness, or what one period medical text described as difficulty adjusting to the feminine role. The problem was not the role. The problem, in the medical consensus of the era, was the woman who struggled to accept it. The medical establishment of the post-war era was overwhelmingly male doctors, male researchers, male editors of the journals that published the theories that shaped clinical practice. The patients being treated for nervous conditions, adjustment difficulties, and the range of psychological distress that clustered under the mid-century diagnosis of neurosis were overwhelmingly female. This disproportion was not, in the clinical literature of the time, read as a structural problem. It was read as a biological fact. Women were more prone to emotional dysregulation, more vulnerable to anxiety, more susceptible to the psychological difficulties that modern domestic life occasionally produced. The solution was therefore individual and pharmacological, rather than social and structural. She needed adjusting. The situation did not. The baby care advice was its own domain of authority. Dr. Benjamin Spock's Baby and Child Care, published in 1946 and read by nearly every new mother in the following decades, was genuinely progressive in some respects, warmer, more flexible, and more child-centered than the rigid scheduled feeding regimens that had preceded it. But the book's assumption that the primary parent was the mother, that childcare decisions flowed through her, and that the father's involvement was supplementary rather than essential, reinforced exactly the division of labour the era was built on. Spock was kind. Spock was readable. Spock also assumed she was there all day, which she was, because the whole structure assumed she was there all day. The well baby visit was a routine appointment at which the doctor assessed the infant's development and offered the mother guidance on feeding, sleeping, and behaviour management. The guidance was directive rather than collaborative, she reported. He evaluated, he advised, she complied, or she was a mother who was not following the doctor's recommendations, which was a category with significant social weight attached to it. If the baby was not gaining weight on the schedule the doctor expected, she was doing something wrong. If the child was slow to meet a developmental milestone, she was doing something wrong. The reflexive location of responsibility in the mother was so normalized that it was not experienced as blame, it was experienced as the natural order of pediatric care. The prescribing of tranquilizers to housewives experiencing psychological distress reached levels that, viewed from the present, constitute one of the more revealing datasets of the era. By the late 1950s, Milltown was the best-selling drug in American pharmaceutical history, and the demographic driving those sales was not hard to identify. Women experiencing anxiety, insomnia, irritability, and the generalized emotional flatness that follows prolonged stress without adequate support were prescribed medication that reduced the acuity of those symptoms without touching their cause. The cause was a set of social arrangements. The treatment was a pill. The pill worked well enough that the arrangements were not required to change, and the women who took them often felt, for a period, genuinely better, which the era took as confirmation that the problem had been correctly diagnosed and correctly addressed. In most 1950s households, the husband earned the money and the wife managed it at the domestic level, a distinction with significant practical implications. She bought the groceries, managed the household accounts, stretched the weekly allowance across food, clothing and incidentals, and was expected to stay within a budget she had little power to negotiate. If she needed something beyond the household allocation, a new coat, a repair she hadn't anticipated, anything outside the routine, she asked. The financial dependence was so complete and so normalized that most banks would not issue a credit card to a married woman without her husband's signature. Not in the 1800s, in the 1960s. The paperwork alone was a kind of architecture of control. The weekly household budget was typically handed to her in cash, a specific amount allocated for groceries and household necessities, calibrated to the household's income and the husband's assessment of what domestic operations required. Managing this amount was a skill she was expected to possess by instinct or by training, the latter having been transmitted through watching her own mother do the same thing in the same way. The budget was not a collaborative document. It was a parameter she operated within, and the expectation was that she would operate within it without requiring revision. Because a wife who consistently overspent on groceries was a wife who could not manage money, and the ability to manage money was one of the core competencies the role required. The stretching of the meat budget across a week's worth of dinners was a mathematical exercise conducted in the supermarket aisle, while also managing a toddler. She knew approximately what each cut cost, what it would yield in servings, and how many meals could be extended from it through the alchemy of leftovers and creative reconfiguration. A £3 chicken purchased on a Monday could be roasted for dinner that night, stripped for sandwiches the next day, the carcass boiled for stock, and the stock used as the base of a soup by Wednesday. This was not frugality as a personal virtue. This was budget management as a professional requirement, practiced in a grocery store under fluorescent lights, without assistance or acknowledgement. Clothing the family was a budget category that required its own calculation. Children grew. Clothing wore out. The school year began with requirements for new things that the summer had made obsolete. She sewed when sewing was cheaper than buying, which it frequently was, and the domestic skill of home sewing was common enough in this era to be standard rather than exceptional. A woman who could sew was a woman who could extend the clothing budget further than a woman who could not, and the ability to make a school dress from a paper pattern and a yard and a half of cotton fabric was a financial asset to the household measured in real dollars. The larger purchases, the appliances, the furniture, the car, were not hers to decide. They were discussed, certainly, and her opinion might be solicited, but the financial authority that permitted or declined the purchase was his. This was not a contested arrangement in most households, because it was simply the arrangement, the natural consequence of a financial structure in which his income was the income, his name was on the bank account in the primary position, and his signature was the one that the bank required for anything significant. She managed the household finances in the sense that she deployed the budget he set. The financial life of the household, in any structural sense, was his. What this meant in practical terms was that her financial security was entirely contingent on the marriage, not contingent in a distant theoretical sense, contingent in the immediate sense that her access to the resources required to maintain her daily life passed through the marriage as its mechanism. A marriage that ended, for any reason, removed that mechanism. And rebuilding financial independence from within a system that had specifically excluded her from it, no credit history, no employment record, no independent assets and banks that required a husband's signature even to open an account, was not a project with a straightforward path. The budget she managed with such skill every week was a budget she had never actually owned. Many of the women who became 1950s housewives had been, during the Second World War, something else. They had worked in factories, in offices, in roles that required competence and rewarded it. They had managed their own finances, made their own decisions, and operated as full agents in the world. When the war ended and the men came home, the cultural machinery shifted with startling speed. Women were needed back in the domestic sphere. Rosie the Riveter became an advertisement for a washing machine. The competence that had been celebrated for 4 years became, practically overnight, something to redirect toward the correct channels. The ambitions didn't disappear. They went somewhere else, into the household, into the children, sometimes into a very controlled and quiet kind of grief. The scale of the wartime workforce participation by women is worth understanding clearly, because it makes the post-war reversal more legible as a deliberate project rather than a natural correction. By 1944, women constituted approximately 36% of the civilian labour force. They were building aircraft, operating heavy machinery, managing offices, running households on their own, while simultaneously contributing to the war effort in whatever capacity their community required. They were, by every available measure, demonstrably capable of work that had previously been classified as requiring a man. This was not a secret. It was documented, photographed, celebrated on posters, and used as a recruitment tool. When the war ended, the cultural apparatus that had praised this capability reversed direction with a thoroughness that, in retrospect, reads as anxiety about what had been demonstrated. Magazine articles that had celebrated the working woman in 1943 were running pieces by 1947 about the fulfillment of domestic life and the psychological damage done to children by mothers who worked outside the home. The same women who had been competent and praised were now being advised that their competence had a new and correct address: the kitchen, the nursery, the neighbourhood. That the redirection was experienced by many women as a genuine loss is documented in the private letters, diaries, and retrospective interviews that historians of the era have spent decades excavating from the polite surface of the period. The ambition that survived the redirection had to find its expression in domestic terms, or find no expression at all. A woman who had managed a factory floor during the war could, in theory, transfer that organisational capacity to the management of a household and a social calendar, and many did, running their domestic operations with an efficiency and rigour that spoke clearly of what they had been before. But management of a household, however well executed, did not confer the same recognition as management of anything else, because the household was her natural domain, and competence within it was expected rather than exceptional. You don't get credit for doing what you were supposed to do anyway. The women who pursued interests outside the domestic sphere did so in forms the era could accommodate: the church committee, the PTA board, the local civic organisation, the charity drive. These were socially acceptable containers for capability that would otherwise have no outlet, and the women who filled them often brought to them a focus and competence wildly in excess of what the role formally required, because they were people who needed to do things that mattered, and this was where doing things that mattered was permitted. It was not the same as what they had done before, or what they might have done in a different arrangement. It was what was available. What became of the ambition that found no container at all is the harder question. It compressed. It went silent in the way that things go silent when they are consistently told they have no place. Some of it surfaced in conversations that women had with each other in kitchens, carefully, in the specific register of the half-said thing, the observation that could be walked back if the listener looked alarmed, the question that could be reframed as hypothetical. Some of it appeared in the books they read privately, the ones with cracked spines in the nightstand drawer, and some of it simply waited, patient and unextinguished, for someone to finally give it a name. The 1950s suburb was an engineering project, rows of affordable houses, identical in their optimism, built in former farmland outside cities that were already reorganizing themselves around the automobile. The husband drove to work, the wife stayed home. If there was only one car, the wife stayed home without options. The suburb removed women from the social fabric of the city, the corner stores, the neighbours at close range, the walking distance to anything, and placed them inside a domestic unit that was geographically isolated as a design feature. The neighbours were there, yes, but they were similarly isolated, similarly managed by the same expectations. Loneliness in the 1950s suburb was so pervasive that it became one of the central themes of the era, discussed in hushed tones and eventually loudly in books. The post-war suburb was built on a specific demographic and economic logic. Returning veterans needed housing. The GE Bill made mortgages accessible. Developers like William Levitt understood that affordable single-family homes on the suburban periphery of major cities could be produced at scale if the design was standardized and the land was cheap, which former farmland was. Levitt-town, the model that gave the era its architectural vocabulary, offered young families a house with a yard and a modern kitchen at a monthly payment, roughly equivalent to rent. This was genuinely transformative for millions of working-class and lower-middle-class families, and the enthusiasm with which people moved into these developments was real and understandable. What the suburb's design did not accommodate, and did not particularly consider, was the daily reality of a woman inside it. The houses were spread across distances that required a car to navigate. The nearest grocery store was not walkable from most post-war developments. The doctor's office, the library, the dry cleaner, the bank, all of these required transportation that, in a one-car household, left with the husband at 7:30 in the morning. She was not imprisoned in any formal sense. The door was not locked. But the distance between the house and everything outside it, in the absence of public transportation and without a car, was a practical constraint that functioned as confinement without requiring anyone to intend it. The sameness of the suburb produced its own particular texture of isolation. The houses looked alike. The days looked alike. The women inside the houses were living versions of each other's lives, the same schedule, the same tasks, the same social expectations, the same performance of contentment. This shared experience did not automatically produce solidarity, because the performance required by the era was an individual one. Your household, your management, your standards. Comparing notes on the difficulty of the role would have required admitting the difficulty, and admitting the difficulty was not something the social script accommodated. So women smiled at each other across property lines and discussed recipes and kept the more complicated material private. The children who grew up in these suburbs experienced the space differently, as freedom, as safety, as the wide lawns and unlocked doors and summer evenings of a childhood that later generations would describe with nostalgia. What they did not see, because they were children and not equipped to see it, was the person who created that experience for them. The mother who was always there, who knew where everyone was, who had food ready when they came in, who managed the house so completely that its management was invisible, was a woman who was always there in part because there was nowhere else to go, and in part because leaving, even temporarily, required a car she didn't have access to, and a reason the era would have found it difficult to validate. The suburb would eventually produce exactly what its isolation was designed to prevent: restlessness, intellectual frustration, and the slow accumulation of a discontent that no amount of appliance advertising could address. Because the problem was not the kitchen. The problem was that the kitchen was all there was, at the end of a street that looked like every other street, in a house that looked like every other house, in a life whose terms had been set by someone else and were not subject to renegotiation. Cheerfulness was not optional in the 1950s household. It was a domestic requirement, part of the same set of expectations that included clean floors and hot dinners. A wife who was visibly unhappy was not just suffering personally, she was failing professionally because managing the emotional atmosphere of the home was her responsibility. If she was tired, that was fine, but she should not mention it. If she was bored, she should find something useful to do. If she was lonely, she should try harder at the neighbourhood coffee. If she was something deeper and harder to name, something that felt like the walls of a very clean, very quiet room closing in, well, there wasn't a word for that yet. That word was still about a decade away. The requirement for cheerfulness operated differently from the other domestic requirements because it was not a task with a measurable outcome. You could assess whether the floor had been swept. You could evaluate whether dinner was hot. Cheerfulness was an ambient condition, a background quality of the household's emotional atmosphere that she was responsible for maintaining regardless of its cost to her. It wasn't enough to do the work. She had to do it with the right expression, or at minimum, without the wrong one. Visible unhappiness was a failure of management as much as a dirty kitchen. Both suggested that something inside the household was not under control. The specific emotional labour of the performed smile deserves its own accounting. Smiling when you are tired is a small muscular event with a large psychological cost when practiced continuously across years. The women of the post-war suburb had become, by social necessity, skilled emotional managers capable of presenting a pleasant surface across a wide range of internal conditions. This was not fakery in any simple sense. It was a trained capacity, developed out of necessity, and reinforced by everything around them to maintain a separation between the internal experience and the external presentation. What it cost in terms of accumulated unprocessed feeling was not something the era had a framework for measuring. The domestic advice literature's treatment of a wife's emotional life was notable for its instrumental framing. Her feelings were relevant insofar as they affected the household's functioning. Anxiety made her less efficient. Irritability disrupted the domestic atmosphere. Discontent, if allowed to surface at the dinner table, made him uncomfortable in his own home. The solution to all of these was adjustment, her adjustment, to the circumstances, to the role, to the expectations. The feelings were not treated as information about the conditions producing them. They were treated as a management problem to be solved through better attitude, more activity, and when necessary, medication. What the smile concealed, across millions of households and millions of nearly identical days, was something the era had specifically trained itself not to see. The women wearing the smile were educated, capable, ambitious people who'd been assigned a role that used perhaps a quarter of their capacity, and then been told that the remaining 3/4 was simply the restlessness of a woman not yet fully adjusted to her life, the loneliness of the suburb, the monotony of the domestic routine, the social and financial dependence, the absolute invisibility of the labour. All of this was present behind the freshly applied lipstick and the warm greeting at the 6 o'clock door. And because nobody named it, and nothing acknowledged it, it simply accumulated, quietly and completely, in kitchens that were very clean, and households that looked, from the outside, entirely fine. The 1950s housewife had, in the cracks of her day, small pockets of time that belonged to her alone. Not many, the schedule didn't allow for many, but some, and in those pockets, many women read. Novels mostly, but also articles, pamphlets, borrowed books, the occasional library trip with the children in tow. What they read privately and what they were expected to read publicly were sometimes the same and sometimes very different. The domestic magazine sat on the coffee table. The novel with the cracked spine lived in the drawer of the nightstand. Reading was one of the few activities that required nothing of the household and could be conducted in the body of a woman who looked, from a distance, like she was simply resting. The library was a space with a particular significance for the housewife of the era, and not only because it was free, and therefore did not require a budget negotiation. The library was a place where she could go without a specific domestic justification. She was taking the children, she was returning something, and while there she could move through a space organised entirely around ideas rather than tasks. The children's section occupied the children. She could, in the 20 minutes that created, stand in the adult fiction or non-fiction stacks and make a choice based entirely on her own interest, which was a rarer experience than it should have been. The novels she read in private tended towards certain categories that the era's domestic culture would not have universally endorsed. Fiction that depicted women with complicated inner lives, women who made choices that the surrounding culture considered wrong or transgressive, women who wanted things and pursued them and suffered the consequences with something more interesting than passive acceptance. These were the narratives that the nightstand novels contained, not because the housewife was secretly planning anything, but because reading about a woman with a complicated inner life was one of the ways of acknowledging that she also had one in the privacy of her own head, in the 30 minutes before sleep in a house that had finally gone quiet. The magazines on the coffee table were a different kind of reading, partly information, partly aspiration, partly a mirror held up to the role she was already playing. The recipes were genuinely useful. The decorating advice was occasionally actionable. The articles about famous men's wives explaining how they supported their husbands' careers were instructional in a way that was difficult to read as anything other than aspirational modelling. Here is a woman who has successfully performed this role. Here is what she did. Here is how you might do it too. Between the recipe for a better pot roast and the interview with the senator's wife, there was occasionally a short story, fiction, published in the magazine that featured a woman protagonist navigating something more internally complicated than a soufflé. These were, in retrospect, the most interesting pages in the issue. What she was reading in the early 1960s, as the decade turned and something began to shift in the cultural atmosphere, tells its own story. The books being passed between women in the suburb, lent quietly, returned without much comment, discussed in oblique references that could be retracted if necessary, were beginning to include things that named the experience directly. Not yet Betty Friedan, whose book arrived in 1963, but other works that circled the same territory. Fiction about women who had too much intelligence for their circumstances. Journalism about the narrowness of the options available to educated women. Philosophy imported from France about the construction of the feminine role. She read these things in the pocket of time the day allowed, in the drawer with a cracked spine, in the library while the children were occupied, and she recognised herself in the pages, which was both a relief and the beginning of something she couldn't yet name. Not every 1950s housewife accepted the full terms of the arrangement. Some worked outside the home when the budget made it unavoidable, or the opportunity made it irresistible, navigating the social judgment that came with it, and the assumption that a working wife was evidence of a husband who couldn't provide. Some pursued interests, art, writing, local politics, community organising, with an intensity that the domestic framework didn't officially accommodate, but couldn't entirely suppress. Some had opinions they expressed at the dinner table and elsewhere. The women who pushed against the structure were not, for the most part, dramatic revolutionaries. They were ordinary women who found the walls slightly too close and pushed back the only way available to them, quietly, persistently, and without permission. The working wife occupied a complicated social position in the 1950s that shifted over the course of the decade as economic realities created pressure on the ideological insistence that she stay home. In the early part of the decade, a wife who worked outside the home was read as a domestic failure narrative, evidence that her husband's income was insufficient, that the household had not achieved the material stability the era required, or worse, that she had ambitions that were not properly confined to the domestic sphere. By the late 1950s, as consumer culture expanded, and the things that constituted a normal standard of living grew more expensive, more wives were working out of straightforward economic necessity, and the stigma, while persistent, was beginning to accommodate reality. The women who worked kept 2 sets of books on their experience. At the workplace, in the office, in the school, in the nursing unit, they were competent, recognized, paid a wage for specific and accessible contributions. The work had a beginning and an end. It produced a result that someone evaluated and compensated. This was not an experience available anywhere in the domestic role, where the work was uncompensated, unending, and so thoroughly expected that its quality was only noticed in the negative, when something was wrong, not when everything was right. The contrast between these 2 modes of existing was not subtle, and the women who experienced both did not fail to notice it. The pursuits that operated inside the domestic framework but exceeded its expectations produced women who ran the PTA with the efficiency of a project manager, organised charity drives with the logistics of a supply chain, and edited the neighbourhood newsletter with the editorial judgment of someone who had read widely and thought carefully about how information should be presented. These activities were socially endorsed because they were unpaid, community-oriented, and did not compete with the husband's professional identity. But they were also real work done by capable people who had found a crack in the wall of domestic expectation and were doing something genuine inside it. The opinions expressed at the dinner table were perhaps the smallest form of rule-breaking and the most common. The housewife who had a view on the news, who disagreed with her husband's political assessment, who commented with accuracy on something he had gotten wrong. She was not following the script that asked her to reflect and support rather than challenge and contribute. The guides were clear that a husband's dinner hour should not be disrupted by disagreement. The women who disagreed anyway were not making grand gestures. They were simply refusing, in the small daily way that is available to anyone inside a constrained situation, to disappear entirely into the role. It was not revolution, but it was not nothing, and it happened in kitchens all over the country, every evening, quietly and without acknowledgement, one opinion at a time. By the mid-1950s, a new word had entered the American vocabulary: Milltown. It was a tranquilizer, a mild sedative marketed initially for anxiety, but prescribed to housewives at a rate that became, in retrospect, one of the most revealing data points of the era. By 1956, Americans were consuming more than 1 billion Milltown tablets per year, and the majority of those prescriptions were going to women. Not because women were inherently more anxious than men, but because women were living inside a set of conditions specifically engineered to produce anxiety, isolation, dependence. The constant performance of contentment and the medical establishment solution was pharmacological rather than structural. The house was fine, the role was fine, the woman just needed a small adjustment. Milltown's arrival in the American medicine cabinet was not gradual, it was a cultural event. Within 2 years of its introduction in 1955, it had become the fastest-selling pharmaceutical product in American history to that point. Celebrities mentioned taking it. It was discussed at dinner parties, the same dinner parties the housewife had spent 2 weeks preparing, as a social fact rather than a medical admission. The normalization of tranquilizer use among women was so rapid and so complete that the prescribing of them to an anxious housewife required no significant clinical deliberation. She reported difficulty sleeping, or persistent worry, or a feeling of tension she could not resolve, and the prescription followed as a natural response to a recognized and manageable condition. The conditions producing the symptoms were not examined with the same clinical interest as the symptoms themselves. A woman who reported anxiety in the context of raising 3 children alone in a suburb with no car, no financial independence, no legitimate outlet for her intelligence, and no cultural permission to describe any of this as a problem. That woman was not presenting a structural case study. She was presenting as a patient with an anxiety disorder. The disorder was real. The suffering was real. The treatment addressed the suffering in a way that left the structure entirely intact, which was, from certain perspectives, rather convenient. Valium arrived in 1963, the same year as the feminine mystique, which was either a remarkable coincidence or a data point, and rapidly displaced Milltown as the tranquilizer of the era. It was more effective, had a smoother profile, and was prescribed with even greater frequency. By the early 1970s, Valium would become the most prescribed drug in the world, and the Rolling Stones would write a song about it, which is one way a pharmaceutical's demographic footprint becomes cultural record. The women taking it were not, in the main, women with diagnosable psychiatric disorders. They were women managing a specific set of stresses in a specific set of conditions, and the drug made the managing more possible in the short term, which the era treated as resolution. What the tranquilizer decade revealed, when examined from the outside, was the distance between the domestic ideal being sold and the domestic reality being lived. If the role were as fulfilling as the magazines insisted, the women performing it would not be requiring pharmacological assistance with the performance, at a rate that alarmed even some physicians of the era. If the home were truly the refuge, the completion, the natural destination of the female person would not be arriving at her doctor's office in such numbers with a symptom cluster that tracked so neatly onto the conditions of her role. The pills were the gap between the advertisement and the reality, made visible in a prescription pad and counted in 1 billion annual tablets. The house was clean, the dinner was hot, and somewhere in the suburb, in a kitchen that looked like every other kitchen, a woman was counting the hours until she could reasonably go to bed. Television in the 1950s arrived in American living rooms with the speed of a cultural mandate, and almost immediately it began telling women who they were supposed to be. The housewife on screen was cheerful, competent, attractive, and entirely defined by her domestic role. She solved problems by the end of the episode. She never had a bad hair day that wasn't the premise of a comedic plot. She greeted her husband at the door with warmth and dinner with confidence. She was, in short, the domestic ideal made visible and moving and broadcast into 11 million households by 1950, rising to 50 million by 1960. Women watching these programs were watching a version of themselves that had never experienced a bad afternoon, and they were watching it in the living rooms of their own imperfect houses. June Cleaver, Donna Stone, Harriet Nelson. These were the women the television produced as its domestic templates, and they shared a set of characteristics so consistent across programs that they constituted a genre definition rather than a collection of individual characters. They were patient, they were warm, they handled their children's problems with wisdom and their husbands' needs with cheerful accommodation. They wore dresses in the house. They were never visibly tired or bored or frustrated beyond the mild comic perturbation that an episode's plot required, and that was always resolved before the closing credits. They were, in the most precise sense, ideological documents dressed in aprons and broadcast in black and white into the living rooms of women who were being asked, implicitly and continuously, to compare themselves to the image. The comparison was not neutral. A woman watching June Cleaver navigate a household crisis with unflappable composure, and then looking around at her own living room, which contained actual children doing actual things to actual furniture, was receiving information about the gap between the standard and her performance of it. The television housewife never burned dinner. She never snapped at her children from tiredness. She never sat in the kitchen after everyone was asleep and felt the specific weight of a life that had contracted down to a set of tasks she would perform again tomorrow in the same order. These things happened in real kitchens every day and appeared on television screens never, because they were not the story the era needed to tell. The advertising that funded these programs was the message inside the message. The housewife on screen used products, cleaning products, food products, appliance brands, and the woman watching was the consumer those advertisements were designed to reach. Her role as domestic manager made her the primary purchasing agent for the household, which made her the primary target of a consumer economy that had concluded correctly that the best way to sell products to a housewife was to embed them in the aspirational image of the domestic life she was trying to achieve. The television sold her the dream and then sold her the products required to pursue it, in a loop that was both commercially effective and philosophically circular. What the television did not show, and what made its omissions as instructive as its content, was any version of a woman's inner life that exceeded the domestic frame. The television housewife did not have ambitions that conflicted with her role. She didn't read things that made her think uncomfortable thoughts. She did not lie awake at night wondering whether this was all there was, because the question did not exist in the world the television was constructing. She existed fully within the domestic sphere, was completed by it, and required nothing beyond it. That millions of women watching her did require something beyond it was a fact the television was not built to acknowledge, and did not, for most of the decade, attempt. The social calendar of the 1950s housewife was not leisure. It was maintenance, the careful cultivation of neighbourhood relationships that were both personally necessary and professionally required. Card parties, coffee mornings, church socials, the PTA meetings. These were the connective tissue of suburban life, and the woman who didn't participate was isolating herself from the social infrastructure she depended on. Showing up was not enough. You had to bring something, a dish, a dessert, a contribution, and it had to be good enough to reflect well on you. The conversation had to be pleasant and appropriate. You were performing your household, your marriage, and your self-management every time you walked into someone else's kitchen with a casserole dish in your hands. The coffee morning was the most regular unit of suburban female socialization, a gathering at someone's house mid-morning after the husband had left and the children had been sent to school, lasting approximately 2 hours and conducted over coffee and something baked. The rotation moved through the neighbourhood on an informal schedule that everyone understood without it being formally stated. When it was your turn to host, you baked. You made sure the house was in a state suitable for visitors, which was a standard above the daily maintenance level and below the dinner party level, occupying a specific middle register of preparation that required perhaps an additional hour of effort the morning before. You put out the good china, or at least the better china, and you made coffee that was drinkable and cake that was presentable. The conversation at these gatherings was performed within understood limits. Children, husbands, recipes, neighbourhood news, these were the sanctioned topics, and they circulated reliably through any gathering. The children's accomplishments were mentioned with appropriate modesty. The husbands were referenced with warmth, and the occasional mild complaint that was calibrated to be relatable without being damning. Nobody admitted to serious marital difficulty in the coffee morning setting, because the coffee morning was not the venue for that, and the neighbourhood was not a safe container for information of that weight. The recipe exchange was the most socially reliable move available. Ask someone how they made something, receive a genuine answer, and produce a transaction of domestic knowledge that left both parties feeling useful and connected. What was not said in these gatherings was as structurally important as what was said. The accumulated private experience of the suburb, The loneliness, the boredom, the suppressed ambition, the pharmaceutical assistance with the daily performance did not appear in the coffee morning conversation. It existed in every room, in every woman present, and it was managed with the same skill applied to everything else, kept below the surface, translated into the acceptable register, expressed only in the most oblique of terms, and only to the neighbour whose discretion could be trusted, and even then only to the extent that could be walked back if the reception was wrong. The card party occupied the evening slot of the Suburban social calendar and introduced the husbands into the equation, which changed the social dynamic significantly. Mixed gatherings required a different performance register. She was now performing as a couple, as a household unit, and the standards applied to that performance included not only her own presentation, but the impression made by the marriage itself, how they interacted across the card table, how she deferred or did not defer, how she handled a husband who drank more than was ideal, or made a joke that landed badly. All of this was socially visible and socially registered. The card party was an evening event, which meant it followed a day of domestic labour, which meant she arrived at it having already completed a full day's work and was now required to be charming for several additional hours. She was, by most accounts, remarkably good at it. Divorce in the 1950s was not impossible, but it was expensive in every sense of the word. Legally, it required proving fault, adultery, abandonment, cruelty, which meant not just wanting out but demonstrating in a courtroom that the marriage had failed on specific grounds. Socially, a divorced woman was a disruption to the fabric of the neighbourhood, a reminder that the domestic arrangement was not always what it looked like from the outside, and a subject of ongoing gossip and quiet judgment. Financially, a woman leaving a marriage in the 1950s was leaving the only economic structure she had been allowed to build her life inside. She often had no credit history, no employment record, no independent assets. The cost of leaving was high enough that most women didn't. The legal requirement to prove fault was a significant practical barrier because it transformed the private experience of a marriage's failure into a public proceeding requiring evidence. Adultery was the most commonly cited grounds because it was the most legible to the court, but establishing it required either a confession or documentation that was difficult to obtain without resources and investigation. Cruelty, physical or mental, was recognized but required a threshold of demonstrable harm that the courts applied inconsistently and with a significant benefit of the doubt extended to the husband. Abandonment required years of actual abandonment before the law would recognize it. The category of simply and profoundly not wanting to be in the marriage anymore, finding it lonely, finding it stifling, having concluded that the terms were not survivable over a lifetime, did not constitute grounds. It was personal dissatisfaction, and personal dissatisfaction was not a legal category. The social cost operated through the machinery of the suburb with efficient thoroughness. A divorced woman was a problem in a neighbourhood organised around the couple as the social unit. She had no partner for the card party rotation. She was a potential threat, in the anxious imagination of the suburb, to the marriages of the women around her, not because divorced women were actually predatory, but because proximity to a failed marriage was unsettling in a community built on the performance of marital stability. She was dropped from invitations gradually, sometimes immediately. Her children's friendships became complicated. The women who had been her friends navigated the social cost of continued association, and some of them concluded the cost was too high, which was its own particular cruelty delivered without anyone formally deciding to deliver it. The financial architecture of leaving was perhaps the most effectively prohibitive element of the whole structure. A woman who had spent 5 or 10 years inside a marriage had, in that time, built nothing independently. No credit history because the accounts were in his name. no employment record because the decade's social contract had directed her away from employment and toward the household. No pension, no savings in her name, no independent assets of any significance. What she might receive in divorce, alimony, if the court awarded it, child support, if she had children, and if it was paid, which was not guaranteed, was contingent on the ongoing cooperation of the person she was leaving, which was a fragile foundation for a financial future. The women who left anyway did so at a real and lasting cost, and they knew they were doing so before they did it. The calculation was not between a bad option and a good one. It was between a bad option and a worse one, and the outcome depended entirely on circumstances, her education, her family support, her employability in a market that had spent a decade discouraging her participation, the temperament of the judge, the behaviour of the husband. Some of them rebuilt, some of them thrived. Eventually, in the specific way that people thrive when they have survived something genuinely difficult and come out the other side with a clearer sense of what they are capable of. All of them paid a price the era had specifically structured to be prohibitive, and the fact that some of them paid it anyway is one of the quiet acts of courage that the decade's history tends to record only in footnotes. In 1963, a book arrived. It was called The Feminine Mystique, and it opened with a description of a problem that had no name, a widespread, documented and long-suppressed dissatisfaction felt by educated American women who'd been told that home and family were all they needed to be complete. Betty Friedan had interviewed hundreds of women. She had found the same thing in suburb after suburb, women who could not articulate why they were unhappy in lives that looked, from the outside, like everything they were supposed to want. The book sold 3 million copies in 3 years. The women who read it recognized themselves on every page, not because Friedan was telling them something new, but because she was finally, publicly, using the right words for something they had been quietly living for a decade without permission to call it a problem. Friedan herself had lived the version of the life she was writing about. A Smith College graduate, a journalist before marriage and children, she'd spent years inside the suburban domestic arrangement and had conducted her research not as a detached academic, but as someone taking her own temperature alongside that of the women she interviewed. The book was not a distant sociological study. It was a document written from the inside, which was part of why it landed with such force. The women reading it were not being observed, they were being recognized. That is a different experience, and it produces a different reaction, not the intellectual acknowledgement of a correct analysis, but the physical relief of something unnamed being named at last. The problem with no name was the phrase that travelled furthest from the book, the description of a specific psychological condition that afflicted women who had followed every instruction, achieved every required thing, and arrived at their correct life to find it insufficient. Not broken, not ungrateful, not mentally ill, simply living inside a frame that was too small for the person it was supposed to contain. Friedan described it through the voices of the women she had interviewed, a recurrent, formless dissatisfaction that appeared in the afternoons, in the kitchen, in the specific silence of a house after everyone had left, a feeling that this, whatever this was not the whole of what a person could be, and that the distance between what they were doing and what they might have done was too large to simply accept and too dangerous to say aloud. The reception of the book was not uniformly positive, because naming a problem gives the problem a legitimacy it had previously been denied. Women who found the book revelatory were often women who had been privately carrying its central argument for years. Women who found it threatening were sometimes women who had organized their entire self-understanding around the domestic role, and for whom the suggestion that the role might be inadequate was not liberation, it was destabilization of the only ground they stood on. Both reactions were understandable. A book that accurately describes a set of conditions produces different responses, depending on whether those conditions are what you're fleeing from or what you're defending. What the feminine mystique did that nothing before it had quite managed was make the private experience public, give it language, give it a readership, give it the legitimacy of a published argument rather than the precariousness of a private feeling. The women who'd been reading novels in the nightstand drawer and keeping their ambitions in the quiet part of themselves had a book now. A book that could sit on the coffee table. A book that could be discussed. A book that said directly in clear sentences that the problem they had been living with was real, that it had causes that could be analysed, and that the analysis was the beginning of something rather than simply a complaint. The decade that followed would be loud, disruptive, and irreversible. But it started here, with a woman writing down what other women already knew, and a morning in 1963 when someone picked up the book and read the first page and felt, for the first time, completely understood. So tonight, you've spent a day in 1952. You woke up before anyone else and performed yourself into presentability before the coffee was made. You cooked 3 meals and cleaned up after all of them. You managed the children, the budget, the social calendar, the emotional atmosphere, and the precise timing of a household that was supposed to run like a watch and show no mechanism. You smiled when you were tired. You looked rested when you were depleted. You made a jello mold that held its shape, which was, on reflection, the least of what you held together today. And you did all of this without a word of acknowledgement, because acknowledgement was not part of the arrangement. The arrangement was that it happened, invisibly and continuously, and everyone inside it benefited, and the woman producing it simply was that way, naturally organised, naturally warm, naturally content inside the 4 walls of a very clean house. She was not, of course, simply that way. She was a person, educated, capable, often brilliant, who had been handed a script and told it was her nature. She rewrote it where she could, in the margins, in the quiet hours, in the nightstand novel, and the opinion expressed at the dinner table, and the ambition redirected into the PTA board with an efficiency that should have embarrassed everyone. She pushed against the walls when pushing was possible, and endured them when it wasn't. She kept going, because keeping going was what was available, and because the people depending on her, the children who would later sleep in clean beds and eat hot meals and have no idea what it cost, needed her to. There is something worth honouring in that endurance, even as we recognise clearly what produced the need for it. The women of the 1950s suburb were not victims in any simple sense, and were not heroes in any comfortable one. They were people navigating an impossible set of contradictions with the tools the era made available, which were limited, and the resilience they had, which was not. They are the reason that later generations of women had a problem with a name, and a book that named it, and eventually a set of options that the suburb had been specifically designed not to offer. The distance between that kitchen and this one, between the ironing board and the inbox, between the house dress and whatever you are wearing right now at whatever hour you're listening, was not travelled easily or quickly. It was travelled by women who kept going, even when keeping going was the hardest thing, who found cracks in the wall and pressed through them, who raised daughters they quietly hoped would have more room than they did. So tonight, as you settle into whatever comfortable, imperfect version of your life you've assembled for yourself, with its full access to opinions and credit cards and the legal right to leave and the cultural permission to be tired without apologising for it, maybe take a moment for the women who came before you in those identical houses on those identical streets, who cooked and cleaned and smiled and endured and read in secret and waited for a word that would finally fit the feeling. They did not get nearly enough credit. But then, that was rather the whole point, and somehow, despite all of it, they found a way through anyway. Sleep well.